Hi, everybody. So I'm Jeff. I run a podcast called Software Engineering Daily. I started about 7 years ago. And this talk is really about two things. So I'm a software engineer by trade. I study computer science. And I spent 3 years writing a book about Facebook engineering. I published the book in the middle of the pandemic. And while I was in the process of finishing it up, I basically had a giant mental health crisis. So, the pandemic was exceptionally hard on me. Largely, because of my own doing, but I'm sure some people in this audience have gone through some stuff during the pandemic, and I think as things move to fully remote or increasingly remote, there's going to be a slew of mental health challenges that people are going to deal with, also there's obviously a lot of opportunities in this burgeoning creator economy, and I've been doing podcasting for 7 years, so I can share some about how to succeed and how not to succeed as a creator. So I'm going to kind of, I haven't done much rehearsal of this talk, so I'm going to kind of intermingle some about my personal story and kind of these mental health challenges that I dealt with, along with podcasting and then, of course, the book that I wrote. I'm going to leave some time at the end for questions. I'm not going to talk too deeply about engineering internals or anything, but if people want to ask me about mobile frameworks or streaming systems or any kind of stuff engineering-wise afterwards, totally open for questions. So a little bit of background. I grew up playing poker. And that was kind of my first job. I played poker online, and back when I was playing poker online, I had a mental health crisis back then as well, kind of because I was sitting in front of my computer just playing poker all the time, there was some drugs involved. I got addicted to marijuana. I know that's not really totally relevant to this discussion, but I think it's worth talking about a little bit. That made me go insane. And so over the next 10 years after that crisis, I resolved to become super clean and get really into exercise and fitness and health and everything. And I guess my first thing, if we're talking about hacking the engineering process, is if you have really any problems in your life, I think they can, and this is, I guess everybody probably knows this, can be improved with improved fitness and diet, and that's really been my experience. So I had a mental health crisis back then, and so I had really resolved to have very sturdy mental health, even leading into this pandemic, but I just was not ready for it. So, I'll get into that more a little bit later on. But this book, Move Fast, that I wrote about Facebook engineering, it was pretty popular. So, if this makes you curious about the book, then I recommend checking out the book. If you want to listen to it, also the audiobook is actually available for free on my podcast. So if you subscribe to my podcast, you can find the audiobook for free. And by the way, the talk is called Move Fast and Slow, because if you're podcasting, you don't necessarily have to move as fast because you're just doing a podcast. So the first thing I would recommend is knowing if you're an enterprise or a small business. So enterprises have to move fast, but if you're somebody in the audience who wants to start a small business that's based on software, you don't necessarily have to move as fast. The reason I put this slide in is because I was, through these years as I've been podcasting, I've also been trying to start other businesses. And one lesson I've learned is if you just focus on one thing in particular, you can be a lot more successful. So I should have just focused on my podcast throughout this 7-year period rather than dabbling in lots of other businesses, which I tried to do. Okay, so getting into things about Facebook. Facebook pivoted. I'm not sure if many people know this, but Facebook started as a kind of just a desktop web application. You just go to facebook.com and you scroll through your timeline and things like that. Back in probably, I think it was 2008, they started to realize that there was a growing number of people who were going to facebook.com from their mobile phones, because the iPhone was fairly new back then. And they had to figure out how to pivot to mobile. They had to figure out how to focus completely on mobile and take their application from a desktop application to a mobile web application, which back then was not trivial. It was not well known what the best way to do that was. And Facebook actually made some gratuitous errors in trying to first move to a framework called HTML5, which was a cross-platform framework that would give them applications on both Android and iOS. But that turned out to be a terrible idea. And so they had to completely shift the company to move to native mobile frameworks and to spin up engineering teams. They acquired a bunch of companies to have mobile engineering teams for Android and iOS. And this was a massive effort. So, pivoting happens as startups, obviously. Everybody knows that. But when you're a gigantic company, it turns out to be a lot harder, and you have to do things like acquiring companies. Now, what I will say about podcasting, just some personal experience. I've been podcasting for 7 years, and most of my coverage is about startups and big companies and companies that are moving very, very fast. And one thing you learn if you're learning about business is your business today is not going to be the same as your business tomorrow, and you're probably always trying to think about how to what's the next play. Like, my business is working today, but is it going to work tomorrow? And what I have learned is that if you again, this is going to be instructive mostly to people who are thinking about starting small businesses or who are running their own small software businesses. If you try to change your company prematurely, it's first of all, it's not necessary, and second of all, it can totally shoot you in the foot. Like, so basically, I tried to start a bunch of other companies throughout the years. I've run my podcast, but I've also tried to start an advertising company, a collaboration company, a bunch of other stuff. And if I would have just focused on my podcast, I would have had a much better time. So I'm really trying to emphasize that element of focus. And I'll bring that up again and again in this presentation. If you want to be successful in your career, finding anything to focus on is going to make you successful. Maybe not anything, but I guess identifying that one thing that you're going to focus on can be really important. And maybe before you find that one thing to focus on, whether it's crypto or streaming systems or self-driving cars or whatever that thing is, before you find it, you should be searching for it. You should really, really be trying to identify that thing that you're going to crush. And this is whether you're starting a company or you're working for somebody else. You have to identify something that you're going to be really, really good at. Otherwise, you're not going to excel in your career. You might end up spreading yourself too thin. Okay, so Facebook is known for its portfolio management, and a lot of the big successful companies have this quality where you look at them and they have a portfolio of assets. So Facebook has Instagram, Facebook, Oculus, Marketplace, whatever their other things are. This obviously is true of Google and Microsoft and Amazon and the other companies that have a suite of products. And a lot of what Facebook has is actually, in contrast to Google. Google has gotten a lot of its assets through acquisitions. So Google Maps was an acquisition, Google Docs was an acquisition, and they just integrated into the Google world. Facebook, on the other hand, developed many more of their own products rather than have them through acquisition. But there were certain acquisition stories that are quite interesting. One story is there's a company called Parse, which was an early backend as a service company. So if any of you know Firebase, or Firebase is probably the biggest backend as a service. But Firebase is a popular backend as a service. There was another backend as a service called Parse that Facebook acquired. And this was around, so when Facebook was moving from web to mobile, Facebook actually had an existential crisis. And that existential crisis was that Facebook didn't know how to make money in the mobile world. It actually wasn't a foregone conclusion that mobile advertising was going to make any money at all. It wasn't a foregone conclusion that mobile e-commerce was going to make any money at all. So, when Facebook had to shift to mobile because that was where the users were, they had to figure out a new business model. And one of the things that they were considering was this backend as a service called Parse. So they acquired an entire company for some tens of millions of dollars, and when they acquired that, they invested some resources in it, but around the same time, they found out that mobile advertising was actually making them a ton of money. So Facebook was in an interesting position where they had multiple assets that could have been kind of the next cash cow, because web advertising was more or less dying. Relative to mobile, nobody was going to Facebook on the web anymore. And Facebook had to choose what to do with their resources, and they chose to move all of their resources that were on Parse, this backend as a service product, into mobile advertising. So Facebook decided to shift all of their resources into mobile advertising. And I think this is an interesting example of portfolio management when you're a burgeoning company that's going to probably be big. They could have diversified their assets and kind of gone the Amazon route and spread themselves into all these kinds of different businesses and tried to do a bunch of different things. But instead, they chose to just completely focus on mobile advertising. And the reason they did that is because, this is another thing to learn about the software world is what industries make what amounts of money. So if you build an advertising business that is successful, you will probably have a cash cow that is considerably bigger than almost any other kind of revenue source. So Amazon Web Services makes a ton of money. Their margins are pretty good, but if you compare that to the margins made from digital advertising is almost always going to trump it, because you think about it, digital advertising, you're just showing pixels on a screen, and it costs you almost nothing to serve that to anybody. So there's like no cost to displaying an ad to somebody, but you make money off of it. In fact, you make very efficient amounts of money because it's an auction-based system. Whereas back-end as a service, that's is cost of goods sold associated with it. So anyway, it was interesting because Facebook acquired a company, considered it, and then left it to die on the vine, completely abandoned it, and focused completely on advertising. And I would just say, in contrast with this, whether you're a small business or a large business, you can always go with monomaniacal focus. I will say again, my heart full of regret, I should have focused completely on my podcast for 7 years. And if I would have done that, then I would have had a really, really, really strong podcast business, maybe burgeoned into a media company. But instead, I kind of tried to do all these other things, and it was quite regrettable. So again, if you're any kind of entrepreneur, whether a creator or actually trying to start a software company, again, focus is so key. Facebook was threatened by Google+. Does anybody here remember Google+?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So Google+ was a thing. Now that threat is TikTok, I guess. But Facebook is so big, it's kind of a different situation. But the way that Facebook responded to Google+ is actually a very interesting story. It's a great story. Facebook focused all of its resources on beating Google+, and engineers were coming in to work on the weekends. In fact, they were basically forced to come in and work on the weekends until Google+ was no longer a threat. So at the time, people thought that Google+ was actually going to be something that would threaten Facebook, but in actuality, it was kind of nothing to be worried about. And Facebook kind of pummeled the competition. So yeah, threats are not always what they seem. And again, I'll tie that into my personal story. I have been thinking for basically 7 years that podcasts are going to die. And I don't know why I think that. It's kind of stupid, but I have a paranoia about it. It's really, really, it's just silly. So, paranoia can be good. Paranoia can also be really, really dangerous. It can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if you think something's going to fail, then you won't invest in it adequately. So yeah. Facebook experiments and iterates. It's always experimenting and iterating. It's always trying new things. In the book, there's stories about a lot of failed Facebook products. So Facebook Gifts was an interesting product where you could give people like little digital gifts. I don't know. Can anybody else here name a failed Facebook product? Maybe you can't. Poke. Exactly. I mean, that's not really a product, but it's a thing. Yeah. So, I mean, you can't even remember them. So, a lot of them just get, bundled into other Facebook products like, Facebook video, or there was one called Facebook Camera. Facebook actually tried to compete with Instagram before it bought Instagram. It had an app called Facebook Camera, but they could not compete with Instagram, so they just acquired Instagram. But again, I will just say, anybody here, who's working on a company or thinking about starting a company, you don't need to do this until you are kind of either in a situation where you're out of luck and your product is not working, or you're so successful that you can experiment and iterate with other products. And I would just say again, always focus if you can. So there's a chapter in the book called Something Happens. And this is something that's very important to me. There's a book by Joseph Heller called Something Happens. Joseph Heller is the author of a book called Catch-22, and some of you have probably heard of that. But he also wrote a book called Something Happens. And Something Happens is about modern American work culture. And modern American work culture can be extraordinarily, excruciatingly boring. That's actually why I left. I was employed at Amazon. I was a terrible employee. I was a terrible employee at every company I ever worked at because I was so bored out of my mind. This is probably this is kind of a bad approach to be bored. If you can figure out how to stomach the excruciating boredom of these companies, you can set your mind to learning from the experience. And to a lot of people that's obvious. I am not. I've been humbled, watching other people, spend 3 or 4 years at a big company and then really learn something from it and go on to do something great. Maybe it's instructive that I never lasted at any of the companies I worked at, and I've amounted to a podcaster. So, stay at a big company for a while and learn how to do really good engineering, and then you can start a good company. Many people can live with it. Many people stay at big companies for their entire lives, or stay at small companies for their entire lives, and just work as an employee, and maybe it's not boring for them. If you are bored at your job, and you can't shake that boredom, you really should do something about it, because it can kill you. It can turn you into it can absolutely ruin your life, and I've seen that happen. And so yeah, avoid getting bored. Facebook has a lot of emphasis on the individual. The next slide is going to be social cohesion, but at Facebook really, Facebook is a company that's about people, right? So Facebook tries to build structures into the company that make individuals thrive and make individuals succeed. So there's a lot of ways it does this, but just what I would say is, if you're building a company, maybe this is obvious, but try to make your engineers feel, and all your employees, feel like they have individual contribution and they're making a difference. At Facebook, there's something called an influencer engineer. This is true at a lot of different companies. The idea of the influencer engineer is the engineer who is taking actions that are so influential that they have massive sway within the company. Just like an Instagram influencer, you could be an influencer engineer within your company where you're the person who's kind of setting the stage for the direction of the company. And if you do that, you are going to have a big leg up in your career. So, if you feel like you're always a follower and not a leader within your company, you might want to try to look at ways at which you could become an influencer engineer. It's a position that's sort of not exactly a manager, but you're really shaping the direction of the company. Facebook has something called BOOTCAMP, where when you join the company, you basically have this time in the company where you're learning the ropes of the company, and you're not assigned to any individual team. You're not assigned to any individual product. Instead, you get a taste of a lot of different things. I found this to be a really interesting process. Basically, you join Facebook Bootcamp. You have to write code. You do this for like 6 weeks, and then at the end of the 6-week period, you find your team. Maybe it's 3 weeks, something like that. But then you find your team, and once you find your team, you're assigned to that team, and you work on that team, and that's what you're doing for the rest of your time at Facebook until you switch teams again. This is a lot better than the process, for example, at Amazon, where I joined, where I was hired to work for a team which turned out to be not very interesting for me. But it doesn't work for every company, and it doesn't work for startups really, because startups don't have enough liquidity. They're not big enough. So social cohesion. One of the perks of working at Facebook is at least this was the case before the pandemic, they have this HQ where you really find ways to intermingle with other teams because there's a lot of fluidity to how teams interact with each other and communicate. It's very much the opposite of a highly siloed organization like Amazon or Microsoft. So the social cohesion versus the siloing of an Amazon or a Microsoft, I think, is quite interesting. And I would say, in contrast to that, avoid isolation at all costs in your career. I have been largely isolated for 7 years as a podcaster. I've been interviewing people about companies, and so I've learned a lot about software. I have interacted with people, here and there, trying to build companies on the side, but that's mostly been remotely. I have greatly suffered from my isolation, and I will just say, I think as we're entering this total remote thing, I will just say I'm definitely like a canary in a coal mine. I'm sure a lot of people have had a lot of trouble adjusting to this, and I just think as time goes on, it's going to become a massive problem. I have no idea how to solve it. Like, San Francisco has basically been ruined for me. A lot of my friends left, and people don't come in from the South Bay as much anymore. So it's like San Francisco has become really, really weird. I don't know where else to go. But people who are better at making friends than I am, maybe they can have that more figured out. But yeah, seriously, in your career, it can be, if you're in a good position in your career, what I found historically is it can be really, really easy to just kind of wake up, do your work. You really enjoy it. You get in the zone. Things are going well. You're listening to podcasts. You're drinking your coffee every day, and years can just tick by because you get really excited about what you're working on. And you can go a long time without making many friends in the real world. Maybe you have a partner, but when something disrupts your life, that isolation becomes apparent, it can be really, really bad. And this is what I noticed during the pandemic, is because before the pandemic I was very isolated and I was actually fine. But when the pandemic came along, the isolation somehow changed. The characteristic of it changed, and it became very, very bad. At Facebook, code wins arguments. Managers are important, product managers are important. Everybody, marketing people are important, but code wins arguments. If there's something that needs to be decided, the person who writes the solution in code is going to win the argument. So if you want to have massive impact at a company, You don't have to write code, but you probably should. So it's like if you're thinking about the direction of your career, and you're thinking about maybe you have a year of coding under your belt and you're thinking about switching into product management. If you continue to code for another 2, 3, 4 years, that will really pay dividends. I will tell you that. And I'm saying this as somebody who basically exited the coding world for podcasting, and I've been podcasting for 7 years. And I'm in kind of a weird career situation, because if I wanted to go back and join a company, they wouldn't really know where to put me, right? Like I don't code. I could be maybe an engineering manager, maybe something like that. And maybe this doesn't apply to a lot of people, but I will just say, the longer you code, I think the more optionality you have in your career. So yeah, coding's good. Okay, cross-platform. So Facebook became cross-platform, and they built massive amounts of infrastructure to support that cross-platform functionality. Everybody here has probably heard of React Native. React Native is great these days. When it first came out, people were like, "What the hell is this thing?" And Facebook has done a lot to support this cross-platform. Yeah, sure.
Isn't Facebook moving away from React Native to fully native because of all the problems with React Native?
That could be the case. I doubt they're moving fully away from it, but
Performance in terms of difficulty in fixing, I guess.
that could be the case. I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me. I think React Native was really good. React Native was really good in this time where Facebook mobile was good, but it was not the buttery smooth, amazing machine that it is today. So if people remember back in, I think it was probably 2016, 2017, Facebook had this problem, and a lot of companies had this problem where you have designers, and then you have Android engineers, and then you have iOS engineers, and it's really, really hard to keep all three of those in sync, because the designers want to design, the designers have to design. Some elements are cross-platform. Some elements have to be, it has to look a certain way on iOS or has to look a certain way on Android, and then so there's just all these kind of design language translation requirements, and that's what React Native was really good at first. It was I don't know, write once, deploy anywhere. So I don't remember the saying, but yeah, there was a lot of ability to reuse. But at the point, where we are today, Facebook is so ironed out in terms of what it actually does and how buttery smooth it is. It would not surprise me at all if they really had to eke out additional performance, that they are just moving off of those React components. Because yeah, there's like a performance penalty for sure for React Native components. But I will say, okay, so from my experience podcasting, I made the mistake of trying to make mobile apps for my podcast, which was very stupid. If you're running a podcast, this probably doesn't really apply to anybody in the room, but I will just throw it out there anyway. If you're running a podcast, you look for ways to expand, and you're trying to think how do I expand? Okay, I can do a newsletter, I can do a YouTube channel, and those are the obvious things. And I probably should have done the obvious things, but instead I tried to do the fancy things. I said I'm going to make apps for my platform, for my podcast. So I went through the work of making apps that basically were just podcast players that only played my podcast. It's very, very stupid, just ridiculously stupid. I will come back to isolation. Isolation will make you do stupid, stupid things. So yeah, I should have just focused on the podcast or done YouTube or a newsletter, anything simple. Okay, release engineering. Everybody probably knows about CI/CD pipelines. Okay, that's copied from the previous one or something, but not prematurely. Anyway, release engineering, I don't have too much to say about that, but Facebook pioneered release engineering for mobile apps, because back when Facebook pivoted to iOS from their desktop web application, they actually had the biggest iOS app in the App Store. and deploying that app was incredibly difficult. And this was actually another reason why why React Native was really important, because React Native allowed them to ship hotfixes, because they could just like have these web endpoints that they could pull source code from, rather than having to do a release every time they wanted to update any component of the app. Has anybody here done well, yeah, but has anybody here like been a release engineer for a mobile application? Okay.
Are you talking about the iOS store?
Yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah.
It's still terrible. It's probably.
Customers complaining to you for like 3, 5, or even 1 month. Why isn't this fixed yet? It's like, it's in Apple's hands. You can't do anything about it.
Right. So it's bad now. It was much worse back then, and for Facebook it was really, really hard. So Facebook built up a whole suite of tools to help them with release engineering. Everybody here who like develops back-end services or just develops for the web, you have it easy. If you develop mobile applications, your life is not fun in terms of release engineering. Networking. Okay, so Facebook developed GraphQL, which probably a lot of people here know. GraphQL was really useful for overcoming mobile bandwidth problems. So if you have a mobile phone, that mobile, and let's say you're loading a news feed on your mobile phone, and when your phone loads news feed, your phone has to decide how many newsfeed items am I going to grab, and how many comments am I going to grab from those newsfeed items. And if you continue down that rabbit hole, newsfeed is actually incredibly complicated, and there's a ton of data that you could need to grab. And describing those requests and grabbing the right amount of data is actually quite tricky. And in order to people don't remember this, or you may not remember this, but back in 2008, whenever Facebook was kind of moving to mobile, Facebook had to figure out how to accommodate the painfully slow mobile networks, because cellular networks were pretty bad. So in order to overcome that, actually this was overcome more like in 2010, 2011, or 2012, somewhere around then, they developed GraphQL. And GraphQL let them be more selective about how they fetched items from the server in order to overcome mobile networking requirements. So Facebook has also done a ton of other stuff to improve their networking, but you'll have to read the book for that. And this equation down here, so this is more an equation about my life. So the 2 to the n kind of describes how you can grow by word of mouth. So if n is the number of people you know, the value of your network is going to grow exponentially as the number of people you know grows, because if you know 2 people and you can connect to those people, the value of your network grows, and then the more people you know, the more people you can connect to each other, and you become kind of an important node in an ecosystem, and life is good. So if you're early on in your career, networking with other people can be really, really important. It can be really, really valuable for unlocking opportunities. And I would advise anybody to do that. Get involved in whatever open source ecosystems, get to know influential developers, tweet a lot, do whatever you can do to get known out there. Try to become an influencer engineer. Try to become someone of note. It's going to make your career a whole lot easier. What I have learned in the last year, 6 months, as I've had a massive mental health crisis and breakdown, is that the inverse equation is also true. The more people you know when you're having a massive online mental health crisis, the faster your network implodes. And I don't know if that equation even makes sense in that context, but all I will say is you can lose the network. The larger your network is, the faster you can lose it if you have a massive online meltdown. So don't do that. Facebook has something called rethinking best practices. So this is not as much of a thing. Well, it still is kind of a thing, but it's not as much of a thing anymore. Software architecture back in, call it 2014, 2015, and before, and let's call it from 1995 to 2015. Really had this concept of like best practices, and there still are best practices for sure. But I think best practices in software architecture were really, really solidified. Things like model view controller and design patterns and things like that. They were important, and they always will be important. But Facebook was successful oftentimes by rethinking best practices. And the reason rethinking best practices made sense for Facebook is because Facebook was trying to move incredibly fast, and it didn't spend as much time doing design documents and doing things that would ensure that it adhered to those best practices. The other thing I'll say is that I think best practices and software architecture in general changes a lot when you have highly modular back-end components, things like Courier. You have services that do a lot of the work for you these days. A lot of the work of an engineer these days, for many of you in the audience, is just wiring together like very, very high-level back-end services like SageMaker or Cloudflare, or these things that do a ton of work for you. So your work is like less about best practice, although there's plenty of best practices, but your work is less about these software architectural best practices and more about like Lego building block plugging in best practices. And I will just say, there are also best practices in life and in business. I have ignored a lot of the business best practices, again, like doing things like making my own mobile apps for a podcast. So yeah, don't always do this. Don't always try to be like the contrarian person. You can get really far in your career by kind of following directions and just like doing the obvious thing. If you're gonna go against the grain, maybe like try to sanity check it with a lot of people before you actually make a large scale decision, rather than again being isolated and making a rethinking best practices decision. So I think rethinking best practices is a lot safer to do in a group. The front end, there's a lot in the book about Facebook's front end engineering. Obviously, React has been massively influential. People who have not been doing front end engineering before React may not know this, but there used to be a lot of JavaScript frameworks that people like cared a lot about. There was, a lot of these still exist. Ember.js and Angular and Backbone. But React eventually stole the show, and React became by far the most influential framework. And your life is much easier if you're on React these days, because it's kind of become the de facto. And Facebook made that a reality by investing massively into it, and also because Facebook had the most knowledge of how to do front-end engineering, by virtue of being kind of the most complex front-end application. Okay, that is the wrong quote. Facebook Moore's Law. There is something at Facebook called Facebook Moore's Law, and basically the concept there is that Facebook product designers will design product experiences, and then the Facebook back-end engineers and systems engineers will develop infrastructure that allows them to support that. And it leads to a very interesting back and forth, because the Facebook application developers, or sorry, Facebook application designers will design something like Facebook video, and then they'll say we want Facebook video to grow this amount, and then the Facebook backend engineers and systems engineers will have to develop all these complex systems that support that experience, and and yeah, that'll lead to a much more robust infrastructure, and then more application experiences can be built on that newly robust infrastructure. So it's a very interesting interplay between kind of the application designers and the systems engineers. And I think something similar is happening on a societal level, where, this is kind of social commentary more than hacking the engineering process, but obviously we all feel it. We all feel ourselves changing from social media, and I know, during the pandemic, this just, massively accelerated for me. Just kind of like staring into my phone and watching these like short videos that load faster and faster every day, and it's really like messing with my brain. I'm sure it is for a lot of people, and so yeah, I think like you should consider that and think about putting the phone down or doing something different. I'm not saying anything novel here, but I'll just say again, like I had a massive mental health breakdown last year, and I'm going to talk about that in a sec, but I think a lot of it was due to abusing my kind of phone addiction, because there's so much good content out there. So yeah, now I want to talk in greater detail about isolation, because really, if there's one thing I can just drive home here, is that isolation can be easy until it's not, and it can drive you completely insane. So for the vast majority of the last 7 years, I've been sitting at home alone podcasting. And this has been really, really enjoyable, because I've gotten to interview really, really smart people at the top of their game and talk about really, really cool software stuff and sell podcast ads against that. And it's like awesome, great life. Have a cup of coffee every day, have plenty of time to get plenty of exercise, just kind of do what I want to do. Had plenty of time for my hobbies, wrote a lot of music, started a lot of other companies that went nowhere, but I did not nurture my social relationships. I kind of told myself that podcasting was social relationships when it is not, and Zoom calls are not either. So, I think if I'm just judging by the audience, most of the people in the audience are probably like at least 3 to 4 years younger than me. And this didn't catch up to me until all of a sudden it did catch up to me when I was like 31, and I started to go completely insane. Zoom calls and podcasts were not doing it for me. And so I found myself in the middle of a pandemic and didn't know how to socialize, and literally went insane, like absolutely went insane, as in clinically insane, as in like going to the hospital a bunch of times, as in like breaking all the dishes in my house and going completely nuts. I don't know exactly what triggered this, but there's just isolation is really, really bad for you. And here I'll just say, like, the gory details were, the pandemic rolled around, and all of a sudden I became suicidal. When I was in the middle of the pandemic, and I found myself extremely limited in who I could socialize with, and my life got changed and restricted in bizarre ways, and I just went completely nuts. And all of a sudden, all the kind of like self-care things that I had been doing in the past, like getting a lot of exercise and getting a lot of sleep, and staying away from drugs and alcohol, like all that stuff began to not work. And I couldn't get the socialization I needed. I went through a breakup, and things just got horrible. And again, this is not as much about hacking the engineering process, but I'm just going to share it because I'm just, being completely vulnerable here. Like, I'm kind of like a broken person right now, because I went through this massive mental health crisis. And a lot of it was extremely public, because I run a podcast that's listened to by a lot of people, and I had a fairly large Twitter following, and which on a Twitter account that now is banned because I went so insane, and published a lot of crazy content, I'm kind of trying to figure out how to regain my life right now, honestly, because I had this very large following. I had all these people that I interacted with on a regular basis, and so what happened was as I was losing my mind and getting hospitalized a bunch, I was trying to just hold on and continue to do my podcast because it was something that made me happy and it just built some structure around the day. But I don't know if anybody remembers those like really bad days of the pandemic where you're just like sitting at home and you're like, how the hell am I going to make it through this thing? There's just something about it that was like really, really disturbing and very difficult to cope with. And it just seemed like it was going to stretch on into eternity. It was advised for me to get on pharmaceutical medications, and I probably should have done that. So I don't. If anybody goes through this kind of like really, really acute, crazy scenario, I strongly recommend just like, as much as it sucks to get on pharmaceuticals, I strongly recommend just doing that. Instead, I actually turned to recreational drugs. And the same thing that imploded my poker career back when I was 19 actually ended up basically destroying my current career. So yeah, I just like cautionary tale against using recreational drugs, marijuana specifically. So when I started Software Engineering Daily 7 years ago, I left Amazon. I was 26 years old, and I really, really wanted to do something cool. And my plan was start a podcast, build an income stream, and use that income stream to start companies. I wanted to start software companies. It was a terrible idea. It was a terrible plan because there's a lot of different ways I could have been much more successful. Again, if I would have just focused on the podcast, or if I would have stayed at Amazon a little bit longer than tried to build a software company. But trying to do a bunch of different ideas at once is just a terrible idea. I guess what I want to say with this slide is if you don't have an ambition in your career, I strongly advise you to make one. And I found a lot of value in reading lots of self-help books and reading books about successful companies. That's kind of why I wanted to write this book about Facebook, because it describes how Facebook became successful. I find reading about, I'm sure a lot of you like listen to podcasts and read books about successful companies because they're really fun success stories. And you can also, study, successful creators, and you can read self-help books. But I think the overarching thing is to unless the ambition has been completely stamped out of you, or for your career, or if you have some ambition like you're comfortable like kind of making ends meet, making a good living for yourself, and having an ambition to just be a healthy person or be a good person, or have a successful family. I think those are also really, really good ambitions. I'll just say my one, and this industry can do this to you, and that's a good thing in some sense. My one true ambition was to start a successful software company. And that was kind of a flawed ambition, because if I would have focused a little bit more on developing healthy social relationships, doing all these things that maybe I kind of took for granted, helping out my family more, giving to charity, I don't know, going to play pickup basketball rather than just going to the gym by myself all the time, I would have been a more balanced person. I wouldn't have had this catastrophic thing happen to me. I would just encourage everybody here to be ambitious if you can, and but to meter that ambition. And lastly, I think this last slide. Focus is so super important. Again, in your career, whatever you're working on, just focus. Have something that you're focused on. Don't spread yourself too thin doing a million different things. I'm saying this as somebody who has, I can list off a bunch of achievements that I have for the last 7 years. Oh, I've started, 5 companies that all have failed.
I've written a bunch of music that nobody listens to. I've done a little bit of investing, but I spread myself so thin that I kind of sucked at everything. So not everything, but if you focus, it will pay massive, massive, massive dividends. So really, really try to figure out what you're trying to do in your life and your career, and just freaking focus on it. Post-pandemic. I don't know what the hell's going on. Maybe you guys have a better idea than I do, but life feels very, very different than before the pandemic. I have not had a return to normal. A lot of people have left the city before me, and I think there's a lot to reevaluate here. Again, this has been a theme throughout the show, but throughout the presentation. But I really think this isolation thing is gonna have a lot of impact on people, and I don't know how to deal with that. But if you're working in an isolated capacity where you're really not interacting with a lot of people day to day, and you don't have much of a support system, I would really take a moment and just evaluate if there's some way that you can do something about that before it becomes a problem, because it might sneak up on you like it did for me. And yeah, I will leave you with this last slide, asking you if you're resilient as you think, because I thought I was very, very resilient. When the pandemic started, I was in great shape. I had a thriving business, great relationship, and this pandemic thing happened, and I was not able to cope with it, and it ended up spiraling so out of control that I had a massive online breakdown, was hospitalized a bunch of times, had to end up on medication. I just turned out I was not as resilient as I thought I was. I don't know exactly how to deal with that. There's a lot of probably self-care things people will talk about. Going to therapy and journaling and meditation, and you should probably do all of those things. Especially if you're early in your career and you have the bandwidth to deal with those things, because once you for example get married and have kids, it's really hard to develop those habits. But if you while you're early in your career, oh my God, figure out how to be healthy, figure out how to be balanced. It's not a joke. I will just tell you, this last year has been so hellish, and it's because I didn't develop those things. I think meditation and journaling and these kinds of things can be really important because they can take you out of your day-to-day grind. Anyway, that's all I have, so I'll open it up for questions.